Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we are looking at two DIY NAS cases, but with a little bit of a twist more than any other comparison we've done, because we're looking at two cases that have been released around about a decade apart. But nevertheless, the two devices here on the table, the Jonsbo N2 and the Fractal Node 304, despite having a decade between their release dates, seriously, these are two of the most popular NAS DIY cases in the market. And although the older generation device has seen slight overshadowing from Jonsbo, it has to be said that even Jonsbo in their N2 and their N3 series have still yet to combat some of the original design choices factored into the 304 here and the 804 that still make them, all these years later, one of the most popular NAS cases in the market. And today we're going to go through their hardware design. We're going to talk about what's good about them, what's bad about them, where the strengths lie in one or the weaknesses lie in the other, and hopefully by the end this will help you decide which one of these two best suits your needs. But before we go any further, a few things straight off the bat. Number one, these are both NAS devices that utilise MITX and DTX motherboards. They're very compact, very small form motherboards. So if you're looking at ATX solutions with your multiple PCIe lanes and your multiple SATA ports in most cases, these are not going to service you. And for those, you're going to have to go get a bit bigger up the food chain for both of these brands. Next up, neither one of these arrive with a PSU included, and neither one of them arrive with any kind of CPU or memory combo. You'll have to DIY the whole thing. So between these two, just bear in mind that although they seem pretty affordable when you're looking at most NAS devices, it seems like a no-brainer that I have to say this, but I will. Just bear in mind, these are just cases. That's your lot. But let's crack on. So price-wise, very early doors. I gotta say, between the two of them, I'm still kind of astounded that this device is the cheapest of the two. The Fractal Node 304, this is their 6-bay variant. This device arrives at around 70 to 80 nika. I say nika because of pounds, dollars and more. I am going to keep touching that vent panel there at the bottom. So I'm just going to remove that now to save myself a bit of bother. More on that later on. And at the same time, the Jonsbo case is widely available. They're both pretty largely available, which again, given the huge disparity in release times, I'm kind of surprised by. But the Jonsbo N2, if you shop around on things like Aliexpress and you don't mind waiting a fair old bit of time for it to arrive, then you can pick this up for about a 70 to 80 nick, a very, very comparable price. But realistically, once you're factoring in delivery costs, delays, you're going to start looking at local. When you look at local, this device is going to knock around for about 120 to maybe 140 nika. So in terms of pricing, I will say straight away that the Jonsbo does overall always seemingly work out as the worst in terms of price. They're both metal in most cases with a little bit of plastic here or there. And one thing you may have already noticed here is the size difference between them. These two NAS devices have an exceedingly different stance when it comes to the size of a NAS system. Now, you know, in terms of storage, this supports 6 SATA storage drives. There are modifications, and as it's been in the market for as long as it has, the people have found loads of ways and means to introduce more storage, taking advantage of M.2 SATA adapters, taking advantage of storage PCIe cards, taking advantage of combined adapters where you can put 2 SATA drives into a single enclosure. All of those, but by default, out the gate, as it is, this is a 6-bay SATA drive. Now, in the case of the Jonsbo N2, this is a 5-bay SATA drive. It's got 5, but it's also got another little SATA slot inside for 2.5 inch. So, if you're only thinking about 3.5 inch drives, this is still giving you more. We'll talk a little bit more about those bays later on, because I do think it's important. But when we're factoring in a couple of DIY NAS cases that are going to be installed with MITX boards inside, I think another thing we really have to talk about is ventilation and cooling, because that's a lot of storage going inside a relatively small casing here. We're not going for a tall, big old standard PC tower there. And with that, you're going to need to know that in 24/7 operation, that your drives, your CPU and all the surrounding guff is kept lovely and cool at the best of its operation to avoid degradation. And unsurprisingly, as you can see from the sort of spaces we're talking about here, ventilation in practically every single way, active and passive, is better on the Fractal Node. Yes, it's got a whole lot more space to playing with, and I looked at the dimensions are 250mm by 210mm by 374mm. This is 222 by 222 by 224mm. It is far more cubular, and this is way more rectangular overall. But when it comes to the ventilation, both the passive and the active on this is better in so many different ways. Notwithstanding the ventilation panel you can see there, and that is the ventilation panel that largely sits in an alignment with the CPU fan. But on the other side, you've got ventilation there for PCIe cards, something we're really going to enjoy talking about later on. On the rear, we have got a large fan there, kind of large capacity fan there as well, and it's 140mm that fan, and a couple of good old big 92mm fans inside here as well. So 3 active cooling fans. Also on the base, we've got further ventilation and a mesh panel to collect lint and dust in there. So there's a huge degree of ventilation at almost every side on this, barring the top there. Now, if we compare that to the Jonsbo, now the Jonsbo has ventilation here where our motherboard lives. So in the case of the Fractal, the motherboard there is based on the very base of the system. This, on the other hand, has a small amount of ventilation there on that side, which is dedicated to the PCIe slot. And the other side, a much larger ventilation panel here at the base, and that is for our CPU fan, as well as the other ventilation there for the other side of that MoBo to carry the air through. Also at the top, we've got a further ventilation strip there just above the MITX motherboard, and at the very top, another vent panel there. But something I've not really alluded to is the fan here, because this system has one fan. It's a large fan, fair play, it is a big old fan, 120mm, but still nonetheless, we are still talking about a 120mm fan that is the only active cooling system inside this device. The PSU there, we'll talk about that more later on, takes up a large block of space, and modifications to try to put fans in here are going to be difficult. Now, in the case of the Jonsbo N3, something we've talked about in the channel before, they've added further ventilation to that top panel, as well as adding there at the front more vent holes. That is not present on the N2, so you can't put fans here because there's no way for the air to be drawn through either side of that fan by putting them inside. So even if you wanted to add more fans inside this system, you're going to struggle because there's no available space here at the base. The front has got the storage bays. There's no real space here to put fans other than a CPU cooler. And even the CPU cooler, you haven't got as much space to play with. More on that later on. But what you do have is that fan. Now, when I talked about the cooling and the fans here on the Fractal node, when I say there are 3 fans inside and a whole lot of room to play with, I'm not kidding. Inside, you have an enormous cavity to play with straight away out of the gate. Move that there. There is our top rear-mounted silent fan as well. And on the other side, you can just make them out there at the end. 2 more cooling fans here located behind the storage bays. Remember, this device was released a decade or so ago, and that's some great foolproof future-proofing when at that point a decade ago DIY NAS builds were nowhere near as elaborately put together as this one. Another thing worth touching on with these devices here, I mentioned earlier on that you're only getting the case and you've got to buy your MoBo and your CPU and everything separate and your PSU and that. It is worth highlighting they both arrive with USB connectivity straight out the gate. Now this is one of those areas where we have seen changing tides in the way storage has evolved over the last decade or so, where the Jonsbo takes a lead. So in the case of the Fractal design, on the side here we've got 2 USB ports here, USB Type-C and USB Type-A, and they're 3.2 Gen 1, so 5 gigabits per second, their connectivity, and some audio sockets. In the case of the Jonsbo N2, on the other hand, we've got a couple of USB ports, but at least one of them is a USB Type-C, and at least one of them is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 port, so 10 gigabits per second. So an increased performance possible with locally attached storage drives, and of course there is the combined audio in and audio out sockets. Those tiny little quality of life improvements that have occurred over the decades since this has arrived that has clearly garnered a lot of favour, and another reason why, despite the 304 being a very popular device, the Jonsbo has leaped to a lot of people's attention thanks to that compact and more modern aesthetic, and also keeping things a little smaller, I think, for a lot of users. But one area between these two devices that I really think will divide opinion massively is to do with the way storage is handled. And this is another one of those things that even a decade ago I wasn't a huge fan of when I would see some of these in the wild, because I think it is a good case, and it was to do with your storage. Now, this device here arrives with those 6 individual storage areas that you can put your 2.5 inch and your 3.5 inch drives inside. You don't have to go ahead and fully populate it. You can pop just one drive in if you want, and depending on your OS of choice, you can run all kinds of RAID configurations depending on your setup. However, the drives go in these little caddies. These caddies here have 2 drive bays each, so you can attach a drive either side of that. So if we grab ourselves a hard drive, we can find out, we take the drive and the drive goes in like so, screwed in and held in place in the little caddy, which in turn is then slotted inside this system. You still have to go ahead and attach your SATA power and your SATA data cable, which you're going to have to run into the MoBo, again, be abreast of your SATA ports. But on top of that, with this, that's more loose cabling that's going to be running around inside this system directly from this to the MoBo. Now, again, maybe you're using an M.2 adapter, maybe you're using a PCIe RAID card, whatever. But nevertheless, that's still some cabling to factor in there. Now, the reason I say that 10 years down the line, I'm not a big fan of that and wasn't really in the first place. One, that makes hot swapping on this tremendously difficult. So all these NAS devices here, if you look at the 4 bays on this Synology, let's say one of those drives was failing me, the ability for me to be able to pull that out while the system's in operation, because the system's gone into a degraded state anyway, I know this is the drive that's not working, get myself a new drive, introduce that new drive there and slot it in, is going to be hugely beneficial to me. I don't have to power down the device. The system will still allow users to access the data in the degraded state, although you have a lower performance number. And when I introduce the new RAID, the RAID will rebuild. And again, depending on your file system, your OS of choice, that RAID could take anywhere from minutes to hours. Hell, if you're running true NAS, resilvering, bosh, if it's just a case of the drive being temporarily disconnected. So hot swapping does have a place these days, and again, now we're seeing E1S drives arrive on the scene that allow you to hot swap NVMe SSDs as well. So this is a very convoluted way for me to hot swap my drives, not helped further by the fact you're going to have 2 drives in this caddy, so you're going to need to disconnect those 2 drives, the port, the data and the power, disconnect it to access that drive, which is not going to be easy to remove from this without removing the whole caddy and trying your best not to accidentally disconnect the other drive, leading to, of course, having to power the device down and thereby adding more downtime to that RAID repair. Now, in the case of the Jonsbo, they, kept it simple. They're bays. I've mentioned in my solution, in my video for this before and the N3, I'm not a fan of the way they've gone about adding trays in this, with this rubber thing here at the top and the rubber feet there that guide the drive into the backplane there. But nonetheless, I would much rather have this where hot swapping is supported than these little caddy things here, because even in these caddy bays, when you look online, there are modifications. Someone's going to say that in the comments. You can get cage adapters where you can eliminate the use of these and have either top-loaded drive bays, but again, they're going to be 2.5 inch because of the placement of the PSU, or modified caddies that allow you to turn this into an 8 bay. They all exist. But it's still a lot of faffing around, and still, I like the idea of this having hot swappable bays, and I know this panel can be removed. I know there is modifications that can be made to those fans here based inside, but still, that lack of hot swappability is one of the things that really puts me off the Fractal node in terms of a rotational environment there, in terms of my storage. However, another thing I will highlight between these two, that is one area of distinct change between them, is to do with the backplane inside. Because remember I mentioned those individual drive bays in here? These individual drive bays are fed into a storage backplane, that little green board there. And that backplane there, powered by 2 Molex adapters from the PSU, runs into that backplane, and that backplane there has already got 5 pre-attached SATA and SAS connectors. You can even swap that out in the case of this and other cases to utilize an HD SAS card that allows you to get even better performance there, but some modding is required. Nonetheless, it means you're not going to have to muck around with data and SATA power in the same way. Yes, you still need to run those SATA cables, those ones in blue, into the top of this case to get them into the MoBo, but it's definitely a lot more convenient to have that board in place. And that's something I'm very surprised isn't here, because they've got the alignment of those tray bays where the drives are all going to live. They could have supplied a board that could go here across all of them with this case by default. And again, maybe it's available, maybe it's been modded, but I would have liked to have seen that there. And there are going to be users, of course, that state that maybe you don't want to use the storage base, maybe you just want to use this as a shuttle PC. What tremendous waste of this case that would be. So the point I'm making between all of this is quite simply that when it comes to your storage LEDs, when it comes to hot swapping, when it comes to accessing the base themselves for maintenance or configuration, and when it comes to the way those drives are connected in a NAS solution, 10 years has definitely seen some improvements there between them. But another area between them, and this is something I didn't like about the Jonsbo N3, was the placement of the way the PSU is put inside these devices. Now, as you can see here, in the case of the Jonsbo, the PSU, the full PSU and SFX PSU is located here at the base. And before you say it, I'm well aware, I hate seagulls, I'm well aware that this PSU is upside down. I did that because the PSU had limited cable length and we had to rotate it in order to get the cables to actually reach the MoBo just enough. I'm well aware of that, so save yourself typing that comment. But the PSU slots in there nice and easy, and it makes it a lot easier to replace. It does mean you're losing a lot of that physical space inside, and of course when it comes to cooling throughout the system, that might be slightly problematic, but it has to be said that they've managed to get the PSU inside this device and still maintain quite a compact chassis there. Now, in the case of the 304 here from Fractal, the PSU, an ATX PSU, is located in this cavity here. There's a cavity plate that holds that in place, and then it in turn connects, I've just walked in front of the light sensor, it connects into an extension cable there at the bottom, which runs directly into that output there. Now, I understand what they're doing. I understand, space is at a premium, and the fact they've gone for a baseline MoBo here with the I/O there at the rear is meaning limited space here at the bottom, but it's a real pain to me that the PSU lives all the way here at the back here, and it's not blocking those fans. There's no way that it's going to be blocking those fans because it's too low. But remember, we just removed those hard drive bays. Those hard drive bays listed here, and then at the bottom, we've got this big block PSU where the fan for that PSU is clearly going to be utilising that mesh panel we've discussed. And the result is that that's quite a lot of blockage to put inside there. It's not tremendously bad. And remember, these are silent fans, so even if they spin up a bit, they're not going to be that annoying. But still, nonetheless, I've never been a big fan of this internal PSU placement, blocking it at the front with an extension cable. Now, there are ways and means. You could have used a flex PSU, perhaps like a 1U slot in, again, not hugely popular, or you could have arranged it and made the case a fraction wider in order to get that PSU in here, perhaps even then going for an SFX PSU. Again, ways and means. It was a decade ago and things change. But moving forward from that, we can talk about the motherboard placement in these cases, because again, as mentioned, the motherboard placement here on the 304 is located there at the base of the system. That allows all of those fans that are on the higher area to keep pushing air as much as possible through a CPU fan located on the top of that motherboard there. Now, that CPU fan that's going to be pushing air all the way along, there is not a lot of space inside this. When we did our Jonsbo N2 build, it's worth highlighting that we went for the TopTon. We went for the TopTon Celeron MoBo combo that you can get. Again, it's available in many different forms, CWWK, and there's a few different variants out there now. There's even a Pentium version, an N6005, and if it isn't already out there, I'm sure there is an N100 version, the Alder Lake new Intel. But inside there, you do have tremendously limited space for your CPU fan. And bigger and more aggressive CPUs, they need bigger fans. It's as simple as that. They even need bigger fans, or very expensive half-height copper piped internal vented ones. So this is that Jonsbo build from before, and there is our CPU with our compact CPU fan. And you can only have CPU fans in there up to a height of about 65 mil, which isn't a lot to play with. Also remember, there's no active cooling here. There's no active cooling here. That fan there that's going to be on the base is not occupying where the MoBo is. There'll be a little bit of updraft there, but not really. The motherboard and the CPU fan have no active fan here and no active fan here. So that CPU fan that goes inside this is not only going to need to have its own active cooling in place, but it's going to have its own active cooling and still be within that 65 mil height bracket. Now, the 10 years older Fractal node, the Fractal 304 here, has no such problems. Now, there is the Fractal node. The cavity for the MoBo is here, Mini ITX. We'll take the motherboard that we're going to be utilising soon for our Jonsbo N3. We're just getting the last parts now. And there we go. As you can see, that motherboard lives there. It will go inside. And that leaves a fantastically enormous cavity in place that's going to be utilised for our CPU fan. Now we'll move those cables slightly out of the way, give you a good idea of clarity there. But have a look at just how much space that's leaving us for our CPU fan. Now, there are questions that could be made that when you have those hard drive bays here taking up this space, that they are going to impact on these fans. And of course, there is a good argument for that. But this CPU fan area is absolutely massive, supporting up to 100 mil higher. This supports up to 165 mil CPU fans, which means even if it is getting limited airflow from those front mounted fans, it's got plenty of space here to have its own big, tall, angry CPU fan attached, which is immediately going to be backing onto that big old 140 mil fan there. So again, in terms of MoBo placement on here, I will say that thanks to that larger surface area, they have got more done, and they've still managed to have at least an internal PSU there nonetheless. Now, cables and spacing on this, it won't come as a huge surprise that although cabling, there's quite a lot to play with here. You've got quite a lot of CPU fans. You've even got physical fan switch, which is actually quite nice for that rear fan. But you've got more space for your cabling as well. So although they're both going to have roughly the same kinds of cabling throughout, with the odd exception for the cooling and extra fans, there is so much fan squeezage into this case. Now, I've had to curl a lot of the cables in here. In the case of the SATA planes on there, I like a lot of cases that have optional right-angled or just angular SATA connectors. This is almost compulsory due to the smallness of that cavity there at the rear for those extra ports. And once the cabling's running through into the extra little slots that are allocated on the side to, you know, feed those cables in, you're still getting quite a messy little environment there. And remember, this is a Celeron build. Imagine you were going, you know, for some high-end Ryzen on i5 or i7, 11th, 12th gen. There's a lot of fluff there that's going to be getting in the way cable-wise. There's definitely that extra space allows you to be a lot more creative about the trunking of that cabling all the way through. Now, this last point is going to be a nightmare to a lot of you home labbers that like to upgrade your hardware on the fly quite a lot, and particularly those of you that are thinking, oh, my network bandwidth, I want that to be as fluid as I want, or upgradable storage cards down the line, as we're seeing more leveraging of PCIe lanes towards M.2 NVMe's and really taking advantage of them. Now, between these two cases, unsurprisingly, a decade ago, you know, crypto was just starting to pop its head up in many regards, and also the idea of GPU cage devices was becoming very, very niche and popular, and that's where this 304 really did make an enormous name for itself. Why? Because of its support of full length, double depth, full height PCIe cards inside. Now remember, you are dealing with an MITX, so in most cases, you got one PCIe card. Now you can use risers, you can even use some adapters if you like to kind of leverage and max things up. But realistically, most users are going to be using one PCIe card, so they want to make the most of it. And if it's a storage upgrade card, again, you've got things like the accelerator card here, full length, single depth. That fits in there like an absolute friggin' charm. And that means that this system that's got 6 hard drive bays has suddenly got 8 M.2 NVMe bays to play with there. This is a Gen 4 x 16 card. That's a Gen 4 x 16 slot. Bang. I'm laughing. Now, if I didn't want to go for that, I wanted to go for combo cards. There are loads of combo cards, some of the newer generation QNAP ones, not so much like this one, but the Gen 4 Q M2 cards with 2 and 4 Gen 2 M.2 NVMe slots, dual 10 GBE. We're seeing much taller cards that take advantage of 25 gigabit Ethernet. There are no limitations to what you can do in this system, and that double height means the bigger, chunkier cards that have their own cooling system, not just GPUs, are going to be fully supported. Whether you're going to use GPU pass-through for some mad Plex build, or you're going to be running a lot of VMs, this cooling is going to allow you to not only take advantage of the fatter cards, but also have a much more, I would argue, ready-to-go circulated airflow, pulling air through the system all the time. Now, in the case of the Jonsbo N2, a case that I genuinely love and have said such lovely things about, a criticism I've constantly had about it is that PCIe slot is rubbish. The N3 brought things up a bit higher. The case of the Jonsbo N3 is a little deeper. It is taller, so it takes advantage of taller CPU fans. But it has to be said, that PCIe slot there is pretty crap. Like, there's no way you're using a card of this height or depth. It's just not feasible. The same goes, even if you're looking at, times 8 cards here. This one is 3/4 length. This one barely fits. You can get this card inside, but you have to do some serious cable rearrangement, and you need a motherboard that's not going to have extra SATA ports. And the TopTon cards are one of the few cards that have multiple SATA ports on an MITX, but they do that by shortening the PCIe slots. So a lot of those TopTon boards only have ×4 slots or ×8 slots, which again means you may have physical space for a card, but they don't have the pre-cut PCIe that allows you to use a larger card. So you're largely restricted to cards like this height and length, which are ×4 cards, which are half length and half height, which really limits the PCIe scalability of your build in terms of improving the internal or external physical architecture of the device. And if you are someone that's planning to upgrade and make a DIY NAS that you can bolt new things on later for your home lab experiments, the Jonsbo N2 is going to feel more limited than the 304 here. And given the 304's lower price point, given the 304's larger spacing, it's very hard to recommend the Jonsbo N2 if you have the physical space that this affords. Now, again, bear in mind that when it comes to managing actual physical storage, again, connecting your drives, hot swapping drives, accessing and maintaining those drives and that kind of stuff, this is a bigger ask. It doesn't have the live trays, it doesn't have the LEDs, and you might not even need to use those extra fans. And look at the frigging size of it. It's nearly twice the size in terms of volume. I think this is an 11 or 12 litre overall scale, including the PSU cavities. And this is 19.2. So it's an enormous change there in terms of scaling. Now, if this supported M80X, like the 804, this would be a very different conversation. This would be a complete total win. But it has to be said that we are still talking about an MITX single PCIe slot system. So although this wins in terms of cooling, in terms of space, and in terms of scalability and upgradability down the line, the Jonsbo N2 still wins in terms of being compact, having better storage management, I would say, in terms of configuration, barring PCIe upgrades, and overall will probably be the lower power consuming system and physical footprint system in your operational environment, not only because of the SFX PSU that it's utilizing, but also that it is going to limit kind of some of the hardware attributes you can scale towards, which I know it sounds like a weird saving, but it is. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. We're going to be doing the Jonsbo N3 versus the Fractal 804 soon, so I look forward to showing you that one. But if you have enjoyed this, we might make a written article about this over at NAS Compares, and if we have, it's linked in the description. But if you still don't know which one of these two is the best suited for your needs, use the links in the description to the different guides that we've done on building your own NAS. Recommended CPU and MoBo combos, recommended design pathways. And of course, use the free advice section over on NAS Compares, the big blue button on the right hand side of the screen, our Discord, the Ask NAS Compares community forum, and of course, you can visit us on Ko-Fi or Patreon to access to the NAS Compares Inner Circle. You get access to the videos early, you get part of our content user polls, you've got access there to our monthly Zoom seminars as well, and of course you get expedited support from myself and Eddie. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.